Welcome back to FireWatch Live. I'm Tom DeSorcy and joined once again by Scott Metzler. In our last session, we discussed how trust is the foundation for strong leadership. Well, today we're tackling a topic that's not always easy to talk about: disappointment. Leadership is full of tough decisions. Sometimes those decisions won't please everyone. But as Scott will share, real leadership is about making those choices for the greater good and not for personal gain. We'll explore how good leaders push work and responsibility down to those who need to grow from it, even if that's disappointing to people who expect leaders to have all the answers. Leadership is about helping others rise to the challenge and not solving everything for them. Scott, it's great to have you back again.
Tom, thank you. It's good to be here.
Leadership disappoints people. I'm surprised by that.
Well, yeah, I think it's one of those timeless truths, and so leadership is a fraught position, whether we're authority figures or whether we are leading from positions without authority. But when we make decisions, we can't always please everyone. I think that's a universal truth.
Can disappointment be mistaken as failure?
That's a really great point, and I think you're right on the money. I think it's incumbent upon leaders, especially authority figures, to get really clear about what leadership is about and who owns the work of leadership. And so, one of the ways good leadership disappoints people is we give the work back to the people who need to do it and who need to own it. And sometimes that's unwelcome news. And so if, as leaders, we equate success with people being happy with us or liking us, it can sure feel frustrating. It can sure feel like a failure when we disappoint people who look to us for leadership.
I think that people expect, being the leader, I guess that they want that validation. Is that the right term?
You bet. You bet. It's nice. It's a great stroke for the ego when we get that validation from people. When we get the message that we're doing the things they need us to do. Often, the things that people look to leaders for are functions of authority rather than functions of leadership. And so, by functions of authority, I'm talking about providing protection to people, providing direction to people, providing predictable order to people. And so keeping things kind of in the status quo. And when we as leaders start to challenge those things by asking people perhaps to do things that are outside their scope of comfort, that can be kind of disappointing. So that is one of the sort of dividing lines, one of the sort of the frontier between authority and leadership.
When you say it's about making tough decisions that not everyone will like, clearly it's not a popularity contest. And I think that is that the first lesson you should be learning. I mean, when I looked at the topic and read about it today, and I thought to myself, this is like we're talking this in sort of series down the series here. Shouldn't this be number one? But then I went, oh, wait a second, maybe it's not the number one leadership trait.
Yeah. I think a lot of the things that we've talked about before today sort of help frame up this understanding of, what leadership is like when we're doing hands-on, boots on the ground, in the trenches, adaptive leadership. And so we're not talking about, we're going to start using blue ink instead of black ink when we write our reports, or, maybe the fire truck is a one color versus another color. When we're talking about adaptive change and adaptive leadership, we're typically talking about things that really challenge the values of the people who are sort of playing the game.
Does it go back to the relationship and trust factor then?
I think it certainly does. It certainly does. Especially if I know as a leader that part of my job is to challenge the people who look to me for leadership. And by challenge, I mean help them grow, invest in their promotion, perhaps investing in them playing the game at a deeper or higher level. That's going to create some discomfort. And if I know that I'm going to create discomfort, I also know that in order for people to come along on this journey with me, they're going to have to trust me and they're going to have to trust the process.
So when you say trust the process, are you intending in teaching leadership that we should be doing this on purpose? We should be disappointing people on purpose, or is that should be treated as, say, a byproduct of
Right.
good leadership and the fact
Yeah.
that people get disappointed? Oh, they learned by this.
Right, right. I think the answer is probably a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. And so, if you're doing good leadership, you're going to disappoint people as a byproduct. I think a necessary leadership move, though, is to recognize that's going to happen, to anticipate that as a byproduct, and to normalize having conversations about that. And so, one of the things that implicit leadership theory tells us, for example, is that everybody has an idea about what good leadership looks like and feels like and smells like. And if we keep those ideas in people's heads, we're really going to frustrate people. But if we can get people to talk about what good leadership means to them, and I can talk about what good leadership means to me, then we can sort of increase that understanding, and we can talk about the idea that when I am leading from my base of authority, here's what that might look like, and it might be really comfortable. I might be in a position to solve some problems for you. But when I exercise leadership from this place outside my scope of authority, and I invite you to come along to this, maybe one step over the edge of what's comfortable, it's going to get risky and it's going to get disappointing from time to time, but it's necessary for all of our growths.
I'm thinking the strong leader is going to recognize the disappointment and say, this is now the opportunity that it really is. Does that make sense, what I said?
That makes perfect sense. We've talked from time to time about the need to divorce our ego from our leadership role. And oftentimes that can be really hard to do. But when we're able to do that, we can kind of get outside of the sort of typical, traditional, and comfortable scope of leadership and really have those growth conversations.
You talk about making sure that these decisions that when then the decisions that will often disappoint, that they're as transparent as possible, and not for the benefit of the group, but rather the benefit of the decision maker. Can you explain that?
Well, yeah. And so I think it's yet another timeless truth that people tend to support those things that they're invited to help create. And so I understand very clearly that every decision cannot be made by every individual from an organization. We can't have oftentimes 20 or 50 or 1,000 people in the room making the decision. It's not very efficient, and it's oftentimes not very appropriate. But when we can't invite people into the decision-making process, the very next best thing is to make sure that we're transparent about what the decision is, how the decision was made, and why the decision makes sense for our organizational health. That's really important to have those conversations.
I'm thinking back to my time in the role, and I'm thinking that, again, not on purpose, but if you're doing it, you realize you're doing it, and sort of answering the questions before they get asked. I would assume that's how I would put it.
You bet. You bet. The ability to anticipate pain points for people and to get in front of those pain points is really a fundamental leadership move. And so, oftentimes when we think about leading change, we tend to focus on the technical things. And so, whatever that change is, we can create a schedule and check sheets and punch lists, and we tend to think those are the important things about organizational or adaptive change, and they are important. But more important is how we lead people through those changes, because change often creates a sense of loss for people. And sometimes that loss is simply, I was comfortable in the old way. You're asking me to set that aside and do something new that seems risky and uncomfortable. And so if we can predict that loss, we can speak to it. And that's a fundamental leadership move.
So, you said kind of the magic word for me, the predict word, where I think that the people under you start to predict the way you will react. That I think is kind of dangerous in any situation.
I don't know. So, we talked last time about the idea that trust is a function of consistency over time. And so when people predict, maybe not exactly what the leader is going to do, but how the leader might process information, how the leader might make decisions, how the leader might communicate those decisions, whether they're honest, whether they're trustworthy, whether they're consistent. I think those are really important. So, us as people who look to others for leadership, we need to have a sense of kind of knowing how things are going to turn out, even if we don't know the specifics. That's really important.
And it takes us back to the relationship factor. The
You
proper
bet.
relationship makes this a lot easier.
You bet. Yeah. Leadership is human work. Leadership is relational work. And it's that space in between the leader and the follower where that relationship really grows, and where, we as leaders, again, both big L leaders and little L leaders, need to pay attention to that space and make investments in that space.
You've made the comment that good leaders make sure the work belongs to the people who need to do it. Explain
You bet.
that.
You bet. You bet. Well, one way I think about this is, we've been conditioned to think about leaders as problem solvers. And so, Tom, if you're the boss, if you're the decision maker, and I come knock on your door with a fantastic idea, often the implicit message is, here you go, boss. Best of luck. I hope you do this because it's going to make my life better. And then I turn around and leave, and you're left with a bunch of work that you didn't ask for, right? And so, pushing that work down, making sure that the stakeholders who need to own the work actually do own the work, is a learned skill. And so that leadership move might be, hey, great idea. What are you willing to invest to make sure this gets off the ground? Are you willing to spend some time and some energy and some resources to help us co-create success? Or are you just dropping a good idea bomb off in my office and slamming the door, right? So when I think about inviting people to do the work and to co-create leadership, that's one example of the things that I'm thinking about.
I used to refer to those people as grenade pullers. They would just and walk away, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
I think every organization has that.
you bet.
When it comes to making sure the work that belongs to the people that need to do it, what can go wrong? I mean, is there a downside to this? It has to be treated, I would think, very carefully.
I think it does need to be treated very carefully. And I think a lot can go wrong if we hold assumptions that we don't share with other people. And so, for instance, if the work in front of us is a cultural shift from perhaps an entitlement culture to a merit-based culture, if the authority figures are driving that change, there's going to be perhaps a lot of salesmanship to do to get people to buy in and to actually carry the weight and do the work of this cultural change, versus inviting people at all levels of the organization to be involved in creating the vision, communicating the vision, defining what the work is, and then helping to carry out the work. And so we're distributing that leadership and that responsibility throughout an organization. If we only say the words, though, and maybe only say them one time, a lot can go wrong. So when we set out to create big changes, big adaptive changes that challenge people not only to think differently about their work and their organization, but perhaps believe differently and perhaps examine the values that they hold dear, that requires a lot of continual conversation, a lot of continual dialogue, and when I talk about dialogue, I'm not talking about me talking at you or me sending the email to you. It has to go both ways.
You've said that good leaders build other good leaders by helping them grow into the work, not by doing it for people. What's is this not the underlying crux of all of this or not?
I think it is. I think it is. This is a huge point. And it kind of goes back to this idea of, when our ego is married to our roles, we can get into trouble. And so, nothing feels better than for someone to bring a problem to my door and I solve it for them and I become the hero of this story, which feels good to me, but it doesn't necessarily perpetuate growth in the other. And so, perhaps the leadership move is to invite that person to sort of, do the work of problem solving. And, that it might be a lot more work for me as the authority figure to guide this person and to help this person navigate the complexities of the problem. But when we both come out on the other side, that person is going to be in a better place. I'm going to be in a better place, and we're both going to be able to serve the organization perhaps a little bit better than we were before.
How does when you say that good leaders are helping build people? Is this should this be done in, I don't want to say secret, but it's almost a psychological kind of move when you see that teachable moment opportunity?
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah. I tend to think that the things we do in secret tend not to work as well as they could otherwise have. And so I am such a big proponent of having necessary conversations and explaining the lay of the land. And, for instance, that conversation might be, here are 3 ways we could solve this problem. I'd love to invite you into a conversation about what might be most appropriate and beneficial both for you and for the organization. It could very well be that the person on the other end of the conversation isn't willing to pick up a piece of the leadership. And so if I think I'm helping someone build leadership capacity and they think I'm trying to push my work off onto them, we can really be frustrated and disappointed with one another. So having those conversations right up front, not doing them in secret, I think probably best serves the organization and the people.
You could be disappointing people, the ones that have been conditioned to look to leaders for answers, and now you're not doing that. That's a problem? No.
That could very well be a problem. You bet, especially if we hold these private assumptions and don't share them. And so, yeah, leadership conversations are so necessary. And I can't cite the source off the top of my head, but I'm familiar with the idea that as many as 70% of big important organizational changes fail, and they fail because we don't communicate nearly enough about them with the people we expect to do them.
Is the conditioning, well, I mean, a couple of questions. Is the conditioning, where does it come from? And have they become conditioned as to how leadership is perceived?
I think so. Yeah. I think where does it come from? The conditioning comes from how we have understood leadership for generations. And so, as I was growing up in the fire service, leadership looked like the people at the top of the organizational hierarchy, at the top of the organizational chart, giving orders, and the rest of us executing those orders as best we could. Leadership now, as we approach the halfway point of the 21st century, necessarily looks a lot different because our social organizations, our work organizations, all of the sort of components of life today is far more complex than it was 25 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, when we kind of came up with this hierarchical structure of leadership. So when I say those things, I want to be really clear. That's not to say we don't need bosses and we don't need decision makers and we don't need people at the top of the organization, making those decisions. But we also need to sort of share the work of leadership.
This is almost giving permission, if that's the right term, to leaders. It's one thing to teach leaders who aren't leaders now, but it's another thing to reteach current leaders, I think, in terms of when you say that leaders, good leaders, push the work, responsibility, and authority down to the lowest possible organizational level. And it's not because they're lazy, it's because it's where the best decisions are made.
Yeah, often that is where the best decisions are made. And so, if I, as the fire chief or the CEO, set out to make things better at the service delivery level, um, necessarily I might be a half dozen organizational positions removed from what actually happens at the service delivery level. And the best people to both understand the problems and come up with good solutions are those service delivery people who do it day and night. And so those conversations have to happen. My job as a leader is not to try to guess what the problems are and how we might do things better. My job as the leader is to listen to the people who know and support them in their pursuit of a better way.
How many leaders look for, in your experience, look for, or better, even worse, expect credit?
Mm, yeah.
Too many?
Well, I think so. Yeah, and I tend to have a biased view. When we talk about credit, um, you know, I'm of the persuasion that the best leaders are in the credit giving business and not the credit seeking or credit taking business.
Okay, that makes sense. Because people, again, this is the teachable part. I would think that in part of the team building process, that disappointment comes, but it doesn't stay. I would think that gets replaced if you're building a team around you. Does that
You bet.
does that make sense to you?
That makes perfect sense to me. And so the disappointment will come 100%. What we do with that disappointment, I think, is what makes or breaks good leadership teams. And so when we can talk about those things that disappoint me and disappoint you and become clear about where those things come from and what we might be frustrated with, we're necessarily going to have conversations about how we can make that better. And that, those conversations, that deep understanding of one another is, what helps to build trust and what helps to build, effective leaders.
What, if anything, when you talk about accepting disappointment, or don't be afraid to disappoint, and again, do it with purpose at some point, what can go wrong
Yeah.
in disappointing? What's the downside?
Yeah. So one of the downsides is we disappoint people and then we leave them to their own devices. And so if you're the authority figure and, however it comes about, I become disappointed. If you and I don't talk about it, and if you don't help me navigate that so that I can sort of transcend that disappointment and channel that energy into something positive, I might just turn into a disappointed employee. I might disengage. I might, sort of uh, privately and quietly start to work at odds against the things that you're trying to do. And so, a leadership move is to be in continual conversation with people. And when we see people who are getting stuck, we help them get unstuck. So when I talk about the feelings of loss that often accompany adaptive change, when people are giving up the comfortable old ways and starting to lean into the uncomfortable new ways, when we experience that as loss, there are times when people start to drown in that loss. And if we don't throw them a life preserver, or if we don't, do something to try to save them from drowning, that could be an unintended casualty of this, good change, this positive change that we're trying to move forward.
At the outset, we said that leadership disappoints people. We need to understand that. We need to recognize that. I'm thinking that it's a very fine edge that you recognize that disappointment is going to come, but when you try to use that to your advantage in teaching, that you have to be, I think, very careful.
I do. I think you have to be very careful and very clear. And I think the advantage has to be not for me as the formal leader, but for us as an organization or a team moving forward. And so, before we take this risky move from one way of being to another way of being, we have to clearly identify the purpose, because it's going to take hard work. It's going to be hard on all of us to take this journey. And if we don't have a clear purpose about why it makes sense and what it's going to look like on the other side, perhaps we've got some work to do before we take that first step.
What would you say to the leader that is afraid of disappointment and it often for a long time doesn't get it and then is really going to steer away from it? You
Yeah,
have to say, I think you got to condition yourself.
absolutely. One of the things that I'm fond of saying is that all good leadership starts with self-leadership. It starts with self-awareness. It starts with humility, authenticity, vulnerability. And so to leaders who are afraid of disappointing people by making the tough decisions or by inviting people to do more work than they necessarily think they have to do, I would say proceed at your own peril, right? Um, Leadership is a lonely job. Leadership is a tough job. Leadership is a risky job, especially if you try to go it alone. And so, when we can distribute the work of leadership and the success of leadership among our team members, we're there for one another, right? So we're all smarter than any one of us.
I've always been a proponent of the idea that you need to know your audience, and certainly speaking to existing leaders that I'm sure are recognizing now disappointment. Okay, that's all right. But then how does that approach it? How is that being taken by the future leaders that go, oh, okay, I get that. I mean, that it's a different mindset when you've already done it for a long time and you're just
Sure.
coming up. I guess it leads to my sort of question around that, or the point, I guess, more than anything, about leaders always teaching the next generation, whether it be through disappointment or through leadership, and telling them what to do, that recognizing that these are going to be the people that replace you.
You bet. You bet. Yeah. I had a professor once who said, if you're not teaching, you're really not leading. And I've taken that to heart, and I think there's a lot of truth there. And I think as we're talking about disappointment, it's easy to disappoint people. We shouldn't leave people in disappointment. And I think it's important to surface this idea that we can disappoint people too much. And so when we recognize that, the leadership move might be to reduce the heat a little bit by reassuming more responsibility, focusing on some of the technical components of the adaptive challenge, right? So it's kind of a balancing act, and we've got to have our hand on the thermostat. We can't let it get too hot. We can't let it get too cold. We have to keep our organization and our people in that Goldilocks zone.
Essentially, we're saying don't be afraid of disappointment in yourself or the people you lead. It sounds like to me it takes courage to accept this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Good leadership is a courageous endeavor.
And it
Yeah.
seems that down the road, you hope you don't scare people off of the audience. Know your audience, that the audience goes, this was not in the brochure. When I when I'm signed up to be in charge, I'm the leader, and I'm not going to be, and I'm going to be the see all and be all to everyone.
Yeah.
Is there an aha moment there when people realize that it's okay to be not right all the time?
Mm. Well, yes, there is. And I think that aha moment is kind of a moving target. I think it's different for everyone. And I can certainly remember, the beginning glimmer of that aha moment when I discovered that, I don't have to do it all alone, even though I'm now at the top of the hierarchy. And B, I'm probably not good enough or smart enough or competent enough to do it all alone because I've surrounded myself with so many smart people, right? The smart thing is to invite them to come along with me, invite them to help. Yeah.
I appreciate it once again. Thank you, Scott. Very insightful, and we hope not to disappoint at any step of the way, but sometimes we have to, right?
That's right. That's right.
And that is all for today's session of FireWatch Live. Thanks again, Scott, for helping us understand that disappointment is part of leadership, especially when tough decisions need to be made. Remember, good leadership isn't about making everyone happy. It's about making the best choices for the group and empowering others to step up. Next time, we'll explore the risks that come with leadership and how to handle those moments when the stakes are high. We hope you'll join us for another great session. Thanks. Talk to you then.